What is your official role within See-Through Studios?
So my official role is CEO. I have also been creative director of some of the projects, not of all of them. Yeah.
What are the main duties you're concerned with as a creative director? And can you please briefly describe a day in the life?
A creative director's job is basically to create and to impart the vision of the game to the rest of the team. On a particular day, that might mean a lot of different things. So generally at the start of the project, you'll mostly be concerned with figuring out what that vision is, working with concepts, prototypes, really figuring out what the game that you're making is. As you get towards the middle and the end of the project, it is more meeting with the various people in charge of various parts of that and making sure they're on track and keeping everything going towards that vision. You then, especially as an independent developer, you might have another skill. For instance, I'm also a programmer, so I would spend that time also doing some programming and developing and helping out in that way. And then near the end, you're just essentially helping the polish phase and making sure that everything is where you want it to be.
Obviously, creative director is not an entry-level role. What kind of qualifications and experience did you require to attain and work effectively in your current position? In particular, what kind of communication skills are important in regards to directing and managing the team at See-Through Studios?
So I suppose I'll answer this by telling you where I've personally gotten these skills. I think they're very important, and I don't think they necessarily come from a specific qualification. The communication and management skills for myself came from being involved in university life. I was involved in one of the university reviews, which is a stage show, for a number of years, and I directed and produced that show in different years. And this experience of essentially directing and then producing a cast that got up to like 60, 70 people was a huge learning experience for me in how to produce a piece of art, essentially. You learn a lot about how to deal with people, you learn a lot about how to create your vision and how to distill that and how to impart that to people. And it's essentially that kind of on-the-job training that you kind of need. You pretty much have to do it, I feel. No real amount of theory is going to get you there, which is why I feel that creative directing isn't an entry-level position, because mostly people don't get that experience before an entry-level position.
Briefly, what are the steps a university graduate should take in order to find employment as a creative director?
So there's two basic ways. The first is to look at, if you want to be a creative director in a big studio, most big studios, the way in is through the QA department, quality assurance. For whatever job you really want down the road, generally you start there and you work your way up. The other way is seriously just to get involved with groups that are directing things. I don't think it really matters if it's games or anything else, and actually just have that experience and learn through directing something. Figure out how to create a vision, and how to impart it to people. Part of that then could be that you actually start your own games team and you work with other people. That's how I've got into this job, for instance, that in the end I created the job for myself by starting a company.
What is the most challenging aspect of being a creative director? Also, what are the more rewarding parts of the job?
So I'd say the most challenging part of being a creative director, especially like if we're talking about games, is scope creep. It is a huge problem. It is so easy to make your thing bigger, and essentially setting limitations on yourself. Limitations is where creativity often comes from, but being able to create a limitation that actually contains you and makes you be creative, forces you to be creative, is actually somewhat difficult. On the flip side, my favorite part about being a creative director is actually seeing other people do awesome things. So for instance, in our last game, the music was just quite amazing, and the sound and that sort of thing. And for a lot of that was actually just handing it off to people and then keeping in touch with them every so often, rather than being constantly involved in that process. And so it's really good when you realize that you're working with really talented people and you see them bring back really awesome things. It's just rewarding in a really nice way.
How important do you think the industry sees a creative director being as far as developing games?
I think the industry sees them as being incredibly important. With very rare exception, pretty much every company will have a creative director, someone that will propel that vision forward and make sure that the entirety of the game is working as a whole rather than just parts that aren't necessarily going somewhere. I think it is seen as incredibly important.
Are there any gaming products that See-Through Studios have created that have gameplay elements that could have an ethical or social impact upon the user?
Generally not. We're actually, because we're really interested in story, and we actually, if you look at something like violence, which is so prevalent in the field, we're actually kind of interested in trying to move away from it. We're trying to move away from the binary life or death kind of gameplay that often happens. Not always succeeding at that, but like looking at that and trying to look at that in new ways. And so we have had things where we've been interested in like going in certain directions that might have gone that way, but like where we wanted to, like, for instance, in Flatland, which is a game about triangles, essentially fighting each other. So in terms of the blood, like a blood effect was something we were looking at for our game, and this is an ethical issue, but I feel that it very much often comes down the side of who you're marketing to, because it's okay to have that and to show that if there's a purpose to it and if you are marketing it to the right people.
It is said that a creative director has to be able to glean imagination and creativity from his team. Indeed, the creative director has to successfully inspire his team to make good quality games. Can you briefly describe an example of how you achieve this?
So my number one rule in terms of making sure that the team is involved and the team is being creative is that you need to give them the freedom, and you have to give them the freedom to be really creative and come up with really interesting things. Generally, when you are working in a team, there will be some really creative people in there. You've got to make sure that their creativity is aimed in the right direction, but you want to also let them be creative. We tend to do a lot of exercises around brainstorming, particularly involving index cards, where we'll write down a whole lot of different ideas and we'll then go through them and figure out which ones we want to do. And then, for instance, at the moment, we're actually doing a prototyping exercise where the people who came up with these ideas and decided they wanted to try them are each trying out making small prototypes of the different ideas that they're doing, which really gives them an opportunity to express themselves and be creative and for them to do their best work.
What are the differences between the gaming industry here in Australia compared to a much larger gaming industry such as the one in the US?
So the Australian industry is in a very interesting place right now. We've recently had a phase where pretty much not every, but most games companies died during the GFC. Essentially, the money, America crashed, our work became much more expensive, and a lot of our studios were dependent on work from overseas. And so they got no money because they got no work, and they crashed and burned, which was very unfortunate. But now we're in this very interesting phase where there's a huge number of independent developers cropping up and starting to come up, building their own intellectual properties, building their own content rather than working for other people. And doing that so that this essentially doesn't happen again. So while the Australian industry does seem small, it's very much growing very, very fast right now. And I don't know, it doesn't have the huge studios that you have in the US, but in some ways I feel that that's better for the community right now. So right now there's a really supportive, really engaged community. And I don't know that that would have existed if there were big studios still in Sydney.
Okay, Paul, thanks for having us. It's been wonderful talking to you about your position as creative director. I'm sure we're going to get a lot out of this interview, and I'm sure our presentation will be fantastic. So thanks again.